So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Sara Geyer, President of CHCI, and since fall 2021, Dean of Arts and Humanities at Berkeley. Sara has served as President of CHCI since 2016, and prior to assuming her current position at Berkeley, she was Director of the Global Humanities Initiative at the University of Wisconsin, a position she was appointed to after a decade leading Wisconsin's Center for the Humanities. Sara is also an English professor with a distinguished record of scholarship across the fields of Romanticism, Jewish studies, literary and cultural theory, and increasingly debates in the humanities. She is the author of 2 books, Romanticism After Auschwitz, Stanford, and Reading with John Clare, Biopoetics, Sovereignty, Romanticism from Fordham in 2015. She is editor, along with Brian McGrath, of Fordham's Lit Z book series, which has published over 20 books by an impressive list of authors since 2015. In the spirit of collaborative inquiry and commitment, which has marked her presidency of CHCI, she has also co-edited a number of special journal issues, including most recently, Life After Biopolitics for South Atlantic Quarterly, and Romantic Materialities for the Romantic Circles Praxis series. And she is currently working on a book called Strategic Anthropomorphism. A great word for an intro. Strategic Anthropomorphisms, Scenes from the Humanities, which is a study focused on rethinking anthropomorphism in literature, criticism, and culture. It's worth noting in the context of the conference theme that Sara developed a theory of the face and the mouth in an essay called Bucality, published in an anthology titled Derrida, Deleuze, Psychoanalysis, edited by Gabriel Schwab, and her book, Romanticism After Auschwitz, argues for the importance of prosopopoeia in understanding the literatures of survival. In the years since assuming the presidency of CHCI, Sara has shepherded a number of extraordinary institution-building achievements. Prominent among them are the most recent grant-funded projects she leads for CHCI. First, the project entitled Sustaining the Promise of CHCI, New Models of Inclusive Collaboration, supported by a $2.8 million grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to foster diversity and inclusion across the consortium through international research collaborations, summer institutes for early career scholars, and the Voices from the Global Humanities Public Radio and Podcast Project, which is a project carried on in collaboration with NPR's podcast, To the Best of Our Knowledge. And second, the World Humanities Report, supported by a $6,000 grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to support the publication, circulation, and core editorial and communications teams of the World Humanities Report. Overall, Sara has been dedicated to increasing the research agenda and the international reach of CHCI, and to building forms of collaboration that are inclusive in multiple senses, geographically, disciplinarily, with connections to both arts organizations and the social sciences, and demographically across several registers, including stage of career. I know I speak for other members of the advisory board and the larger CHCI community when I say that it has been a pleasure to work with her on these projects and to see them come to fruition and draw in inspiring levels of participation within and beyond the CHCI membership. If you read any of Sara's growing number of articles on the humanities, you will see that her thinking always moves interestingly across her scholarly and theoretical interests on the one hand, and her advocacy for the humanities on the other. I'm very much looking forward to her talk this evening, which is intriguingly titled, Where the Humanities Can Remain in Question. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Again, thank Ranji, Chris, Sylvia, Guillaume, Aaron, and everyone who has worked so hard to get us here after really what's been too much time apart. And I also want to take the chance to thank all of you. I would say that among the great pleasures and occasions of my career, my intellectual formation, has been the opportunity to direct a humanities center, sit on the board of CHCI, and serve as president of CHCI. And I, very early on when I joined the board of CHCI, someone, and I, at least one person, probably many people said, the best job I've ever had was running a humanities center. So I hope that those of you who are new to running humanities centers, those of you who are in the midst of running humanities centers, those of you who work at humanities centers have some sense of the sheer joy and possibility of running a humanities center or institute. And it's in fact, partly that I want to talk about today. So what follows, and Amanda did an interesting job and an accurate job of setting it up. Well, what follows isn't exactly an enumeration or a synthesis of what I've seen or learned or observed along the way. And it doesn't have that sense of nostalgia or melancholy or even transition. It is informed by the conversations, conferences, and also the friendships that have been part of CHCI during the decade or so since I began to participate in it. So I want to start and by just reiterating that it's a long time since we've all been together, face-to-face or side-by-side or IRL, which once all meant the same thing. Although now it seems that it's not the face-to-face, but that which is not the face, that which is below the neck or out of the frame or untouched up or differently touched up, that we have been missing. We're here together, and we have been here together to talk about the face. Our face time isn't a new condition of the humanities, however, but rather a really very old one, and one that also seemed particularly urgent at the end of the last century. John Welchman in Art Forum in 1988 writes, with only a whisper of hesitation, that the face is probably the primary site of visual representation and has shaped the very conditions of visuality. He goes on, in the history of visual culture, the face's significance is continuously attested to, and not just at the moments of its greatest visibility and diffusion. The cultic head, the individualized Renaissance portrait, or the TV talking head, but also in those moments of head-lopping iconoclasm, when it has been most forcefully suppressed. So the absence is, in fact, another sign or a trace of its presence. Whether that head-lopping evokes Caravaggio's beheadings or the entire displacement of the head and face and the turn to abstraction or disfiguration isn't really clear. But what is clear is that it is always the face, as what belongs to us alone and to us not at all, that we're angling to see and to know. This focus on the face, as even this briefest example suggests, which is indissociable from defacement, abstraction, ideology, fiction, turns out also to be a mainstay of critical theory and continental philosophy as they transformed the humanities and really opened the way for humanities centers, particularly in the United States, humanities centers where there wasn't always room in the disciplinary department for the kind of work that was happening and the debates and conversations that were taking place. The way in which they transformed the humanities in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is the moment when Paul de Man struggled to make sense of autobiography as a performative and figural rather than a representative art, one that turned on its head conventions of temporality and self-awareness, leading him to argue that the most an autobiographical work could do in bringing us face to face with its subject is reveal the absence of said subject. For all of de Man's evasion, he was able to make clear the incoherence and disintegration that takes place at the moment one holds up a mirror in literature or in life. In other words, there is no face in real life, only in language or Zoom or FaceTime, as we now have learned, or through it. At this moment, one either can realize that the face and all that it entails is only ever accessible to oneself through various acts of mediation or ignorance, or one can just ignore the horror of this realization and keep moving. So what is one to do? In the face of a similar conundrum, Emmanuel Levinas established the face of the other, and I imagine Aki talked about Levinas yesterday, if not directly, then implicitly in talking about Derrida and hospitality. Emmanuel Levinas established the face of the other as the resource of an ethics bordered by responsibility. This other face is the only face to which I have access, the face formed in and through a relation with others, which is unequal from the outset and a potential source of power. This is not a prescriptive or finite ethics, but one that is infinite. The face is not just my uncertainty, my absent truth, but a relation that precedes my will. And I point to these philosophical and theoretical works, just as I could point to theories of the portrait or the close-up, as we talked about earlier, or to the psychoanalytic work of incorporation, to refresh our sense of the ubiquity of the face in core humanities disciplines, philosophy, literature, visual culture, and film studies. In fact, I might even go further than Welchman to suggest that it's not only visual culture, but the entire project of the academic humanities that is bound up with the face, both as figure, the figure of figure to be clever, but also the act and the verb with its various implications and translations, to address, to come to terms, to make visible, to acknowledge. And perhaps it's not by accident that those beautiful posters that Erica showed us were faces, right? We face history, we face risk, we face crises of institutions, of democracy, of the earth, and in doing so, we also deface them, which is not unlike what Jennifer was describing in our efforts to think about climate change. In other words, we face ourselves and our limits and give face, and sometimes we save it. And in doing so, we're imagining or trying to imagine a more responsible, more equitable, and more truthful, more just world that could come about through the work that we do as scholars and institutional actors who aspire to orient our universities otherwise. And because this is who we are as directors and managers, and associate and assistant directors of humanities centers and institutes, today I want to do something more than just tell a story of the face in the critical humanities. I want instead to talk about humanities centers and institutes in this context. And in doing so, and at the end of my glorious term as president of CHCI, I want to use this occasion equally to share with you some of what I have seen and learned and faced during this period of extraordinary social and institutional change, marked by CHCI's return to public universities as host, investment in global collaborations that would recenter the humanities, and most recently, the reinvention of that global attachment in the face of the pandemic and planetary crises. Each of these turns has been able to occur at an accelerated pace, not typical in other parts of the university, because humanities centers and institutes are designed to be agile and inventive. Few of us are tied to curricula or faculty FTE. Instead, the Humanities Center or Institute is by design open, shaped through its leadership changes, through programmatic and political shifts, and able to hold the humanities in constant relation to their outside. But if humanities centers and institutes are the face or interface, they are so because for a moment they mediate, coordinate, invent, reflect, and convene. This might be because they assume, at least for a moment, an evening, a season, a semester, a year, that there is or that there could be a form for a line of inquiry that is still in the process of becoming. The face reflects the play between figuration and disfiguration and the impossibility of a knowable object, including the self, outside of mediation, relation, and reflection. We have come to understand that this condition has led to the so-called crisis of the humanities in at least two senses. Firstly, the assumed and mistaken irrelevance of the humanities and the professional and technical university system. I'll return to this later. And second, in the political context in which we, more than ever, are in need of contexts, frames, and conditions that ensure we can distinguish between truth and non-truth, or rumor, as Joe Fox might say, in its many guises. And so we have come to instrumentalize, to translate, to rethink old antagonisms in a modest effort of survival. It's now to these questions of survival, of our survival, that I want to turn. So my own thinking about the face, as I started to make clear, and as Amanda also pointed out, is indissociable from questions of survival and the face donating trope of prosopopoeia. Prosopopoeia assumes, usually through a linguistic act, that an object, concept, or thing, which might or might not be human, has the capacity to see, hear, or speak to us. And in doing so, throws into disarray the certainty that our capacity for speech is an ample index of our life and even of our humanity. The face is no longer an index of life. It is more like a ghost or a fantasy. And I point this out because I've observed a turn in literature about the humanities in the past several years, whereby the crisis literature, books that many of us know, on the graduate school mess or the unmaking of the public university, that focus on crisis seems to have been replaced by manifestos for the humanities, New Deals, dreams of America, arguments and plans. There seems to be not just a will to survive, but, and we heard a little bit about this morning, a commitment to move beyond the various impasses and make a claim on survival. And it's on this that I want to reflect with you this afternoon. So one of CHCI's own contributions to this arena is the World Humanities Report, which I've directed and in which many of you, several of you here have participated since 2018. It was actually $600,000, not six, but the report is a collaboration whose organizing questions: where do the humanities live in the world today? What are the conditions of their flourishing? Reflects survival rather than crisis. Further, the report's ground-up approach, organized in the first place around contributions from distinct national, regional, continental, and linguistic settings, has the secondary effect of reflecting the survival of the humanities as a global condition. In the report, the humanities come to appear as other than only a lasting European formation and colonial or imperial project whose legacies continue to shape disciplines and institutions. Rather, the report demonstrates that the humanities are a multitudinous, vast, and uneven set of engagements with interpretation, criticism, judgment, representation, translation, as we've heard, preservation, voice, experience, and aesthetics that are not in any way exhausted by European humanism and its disciplinary effects. The report's contributors account for and recommend a wide range of institutional, disciplinary, and financial interventions, as well as policies and commitments that will serve today and for the future. And it shows further that the institutions of the humanities are modern universities on the European model, as we know them, but also NGOs and museums and public humanities projects and radio and podcast, informal street universities, scholarly societies, academies, summer schools, and independent research institutes. These alternative forms or formations include CHCI's members, like the Forum on Contemporary Theory in India, which is a mobile winter school that includes participants from across the subcontinent, or the Africa Institute, a new graduate program in the arts and humanities based in Sharjah, where 3 current or past CHCI board members have joined the faculty. As well as Les Ateliers de la Pensée, a collaboration of scholars, artists, and intellectuals focused in the Francophone world, and that includes books, a media campaign, conferences, and an intensive program for early career scholars that CHCI has supported as part of the African Humanities Initiative. Yet the new rhetoric of survival focuses almost exclusively on the university-based humanities, designing sustainable graduate programs, hiring more faculty, maintaining levels of undergraduate enrollment, and ensuring lively university presses, as well as envisioning forms of collaboration and interdisciplinarity through which the humanities become embedded in all areas of the university, from AI to public health to urban studies. Everyone in this room has made one of those arguments. In this sense, they raise questions of reproduction and reproducibility, of legacy, and of the difficulty of breaking from dominant legacies that include colonialism and myriad forms of institutionalized political violence. So some more examples of the new academic advocacy literature. In her recent account of the precarious state of the humanities within the university, Sydney Smith, former president of the MLA and former director of the Institute for the Humanities at the University of Michigan, frames the challenge faced by the humanities in terms of sustainability, borrowing a framework more typically used to describe the future of the planet. Implicit in sustainability is that a set of collective choices and strategies, whether conceived as imaginative or sacrificial, have the power to change the lifespan of the humanities and guarantee a future. In Smith's account, the humanities will need to be reconceived in order to be durable. Their or our practices and protocols, particularly as they relate to reproduction, otherwise known as graduate education, will need to be re-envisioned in order to shift from extinction risk to survival. The newly sustainable practices that she enumerates include collaboration, flexibility, open access, innovative teaching, networking, and inclusion. And what I find notable in this example is the way that a long-held attachment to crisis and near death in accounts of the humanities, a crisis that once dominated popular administrative and scholarly discourse, has been subsumed by a life drive. If the earlier account of near death left many of us to wonder whether the end had already taken place, or whether our time was both that of an ever-deferred future crisis and a past event that had escaped us and for which we were constantly making amends, I want to suggest that this new attention to life in the humanities might also correlate to a different history of survival, which is something that Kathy Caruth has described, when less preoccupied with death and newly consumed with life. Another version of this preoccupation with life is more subtle in its appearance, less about sustainable strategies and more about the very conception of the humanities and value. For example, our own Amanda Anderson's Clarendon lectures on psyche and ethos, where life is the concept and condition through which values are established and affirmed. There, the examined or moral life becomes the vehicle for the survival of the humanities within transdisciplinary collaborations and precisely around questions of value clarification and understanding of human experience. In other words, affirming moral life and value as an overlooked or even disparaged priority of humanities scholarship is also the condition under which the humanities will take on a new and more sustainable life in the university and in society. When understood in relation to moral life, the humanities become increasingly valuable to actual sustainability, climate science, global health, and good governance. As both of these examples imply, the life or death of the humanities is almost inextricable from an analysis of the one place where we know the humanities are supposed to live, the university. However, Chris Newfield, upon asking what are the humanities for, responds by claiming that the public university, at least, is already dead. As he explains, public universities seem not just unable, but unwilling to save themselves. Given their inertia, public universities will have an easier time moving forward if they start from the idea that public universities, as we knew them, are dead. I wonder here, who is the public university such that it could come into this self-awareness, awareness of its own death? Is it the Board of Regents, the senior administration, the academic senate? Or is this merely a fictional instance of recognition, like looking at one's face in the mirror as if it were one's own, an act as impossible as the dead recognizing themselves as dead? Newfield continues to qualify what exactly he means by death, if not salvation, describing an institution that lives on as a corpse or a ghost, hollowed of the intellectual and socially transformative project at its core. He writes, obviously the institutions and their activities carry on, the building mortgages, the student activities, the administrative hiring, the sports programs, and the academic labor. But their public missions do not. They no longer present themselves as forming the destiny of humanity. The mid-20th century public university is dead. Newfield will conclude his essay by arguing for a reversal of strategy that would amount to a different kind of revitalizing and reanimating the public university, lifting it from its grave. And I'm less interested here in the accuracy of Newfield's account of universities than I am in Newfield's reliance on a passage from death to life, especially to a life that is ghostly and unfulfilled. And this is in one of the books on a New Deal for the humanities. Newfield makes several suggestions for what universities could do to salvage the humanities, and they mostly have to do with different kinds of speech acts or investments. And he concludes the essay by responding to the question that provides its title. My answer to what the humanities are for is that they are for putting mass Bildung back at the center of the post-capitalist university that is now in the early agonies of birth. The public university is dead. Long live the public university. For Newfield, the humanities are for saving the university as public university and for reestablishing its values. The humanities remain the unit within the university that attends to these values. By saving the university, the humanities save the person and save the people. They turn the infant into a subject and even a citizen. But this account of a recovered and reformed university as forming the destiny of humanity, and the humanities not just as forming selves or a commons, but as a project of mass Bildung, possesses the overtones or the undertones of 20th century populist movements. The evocation of a birth agony of destiny, monarchy, sovereignty, and immortality, even if only in order to issue a somewhat hyperbolic call for a public good, cannot ultimately shed its tinge of redemption, a sticky association that attaches onto this rhetoric of the humanities' salvation and survival. To borrow the insights of Adam Stern's recent theological political genealogy of survival, I wonder whether the rhetoric of survival of the humanities, for all of its strategy and pragmatism, recasts the humanities in a quasi-theological redemptive mode at the moments when the humanities are being recognized as a public good and as valuable to the university's research mission. Taking this further, because the humanities issue from a conception of the human and the humane with which they continue to struggle, I wonder too whether any turn to salvation and survival also hosts a history of Christianity, imperialism, and Euro-nationalism. If the university saved by the humanities stands in place of the sovereign, especially at the moment when Newfield announces that the public good university is dead, long live the public good university, what does this mean for the global humanities? Can the humanities survive in modern universities beyond their European and Christian origins, or is the only method of overcoming also one that seeks not survival, but a radical reconception of the humanities as global humanities? Can the shift from a preoccupation with death to a preoccupation with life and living on be extricated from a Christological account of the humanities, or does it merely reassert rather than rearrange the descent of the humanities from a Latinate and ultimately European framework with the powers of civilization and redemption that it animates and that animate it? Can the survival of the humanities be other than the survival of the humanities as human destiny, life beyond death, and redemption through the university? Are we in need of a new concept of sustainability, one that opens a global frame and resists destinal thinking? So in what follows, I want to draw out this example even further. Looking first to a somewhat traditional history of the humanities that borrows this figuration, and then finally considering a Chinese example in which the humanities modeled after European or Western history are evoked as part of a nationalist project of survival. I am doing so to ask whether there's an alternative to the crisis survival or apocalypse redemption framework and what it might be. Like many of you, I care about these questions because we spend a great deal of time, maybe most of our time, arguing for, advocating for the importance of the humanities and the value of humanities centers and institutes as sites of possibility. We ask, like Smith, like Anderson, what is to be done? Whether that means redesigning graduate programs or confronting the question of the moral life. I'm aware that when it comes to substitutions of life for death and death for life, that we should linger and see how the specter of life and death is overdetermined, how the rhetoric of survival draws not only from eco-criticism and allegory, but equally from ethno-nationalism theology and the variety of administrative regimes that issue from them and that have led to multiple forms of colonial violence and the repression of indigenous knowledges. These are projects that universities and humanities scholars have both facilitated and resisted. So turning backwards somewhat, I want to look at James Turner's Philology, A History of the Modern Humanities, a book that some of you might know. Turner's argument, Turner's an intellectual historian, Turner's argument is that despite their disciplinary diversity, ranging from anthropology to visual culture to philosophy, we've just been down that road, the humanities as they've come into being, at least since the 19th century, are indebted to and entangled with the study of language and literature. Yet Turner's account of this history of the humanities registers still another version of the rhetoric of survival that I have been describing. He opens the book by describing his own singular contributions, explaining, despite many fine monographs, no one to date has ventured an overview of the birth of the modern humanities in the English-speaking world from the womb of philology. And this book tells that story. Here, the feminized biologization of philology as womb and the humanities as progeny, the suggestion that there's an unacknowledged event following a period of gestation that occurs in a moment that could be dated as a birth, and further the implication of infancy, growth, and implicitly death, reflect an imagination of the humanities as a living being. More than this, Turner positions his study as having a particular role to play in the obscure birth of the humanities becoming knowable. It is only through his venture, his overview, the fictional stance of a historian who exists outside, above, and beyond the humanities, makes the birth and the proper life, that makes the birth and proper life of the humanities visible. A few paragraphs later, Turner goes on to talk explicitly about survival, and not just the survival of the modern humanities, but the antiquated practices of philology that are its predecessor, leading him to explain. Because philology's legacy survives in the ways we build knowledge today, the excavation of the philological past becomes an effort at once of historical reconstruction and present-day self-understanding. Turner's history is in the mode of building sermon. But what of this mother-child scene? Is it a Kleinian moment of betrayal or a Christological moment of grace? The mother, while the hero of the tale, is also merely a womb. She ends up dead and buried, incapable of telling her own story, in need of excavation and historical reconstruction, which Turner enthusiastically takes up. She is also the very condition of the reconstruction of which she is the object. So just as Newfield's vision of survival rides on a logic of redemptive sovereignty, so too does this allegory manifest a dichotomy between biologization, the mortality that it implies, and symbolization, the immortality that it invokes. The humanities here become merely human, which is to say, merely mortal, unless the progeny is Christ himself. Turner's account of philology's repression and return is underdetermined. It misses some of the more visible recent returns of philology, which might have shaken up some of the book's more confident claims. So I'm thinking here of Nietzsche, whose relation to philology was ambivalent, but also the late work of Paul de Man and Edward Said, both of whom, as Jeffrey Galt Harpham, who happened to have been the director of the National Humanities Center where we were earlier today, as Harpham points out, despite their differences of style, project, and understanding, both Said and de Man wrote essays at the end of their lives with the title, The Return of Philology. So if for Turner, philology is the origin of humanities that he is at work to recover, for de Man and Said, philology already found its way back to the humanities, whether as speculative science or as theory. And we can see that philology will not just save the humanities, rather it is, as Harpham explains, a way of naming its crisis. It's a very different history than one we find in Turner. Harpham carefully recalls the origins of philology as the study of languages that, for a brief moment, served as a model for science and appeared to be more scientific than science itself. In this context, he also recalls the deep imbrication of philology and racial or racist theory. Passing from Darwin to Gobineau to our present, Harpham argues, without reference to Turner, that we do not merely get the humanities from philology, we also get from philology the crisis of the humanities and the response to crises outside of the humanities, crises of identity, of the nation, and of belonging. We get the antagonism between science or theory and criticism, scholarly and generalist practices, complicity with racism and the resistance to or critique of racism, professionalization and skepticism about professionalization. Harpum argues that after the Cold War ended, the humanities lost some of their reason for being, the legitimating crisis in which they were to have played a necessary part. Moreover, as the humanities, like other academic disciplines, became more professionalized, they became more insular, self-validating, self-legitimating, self-referring, self-interested. The link between the humanities and the state on the one hand and the individual on the other became attenuated. Detached from its rationale and isolated from its supporters, the humanities, conceived as a response to various crises, themselves fell into crisis. And as higher education took a pragmatic scientific turn, other sectors of the university, particularly the sciences and professional education, came to command more attention, resources, and prestige. And having just been at the National Humanities Center this morning and having heard Robert talk about its formation in the 1950s, you can see that this account of the humanities actually belongs to that place from which he was writing and thinking, which had its formation there. So moving from Turner's redemptive account of philology as grounding the humanities to Harpum's account of philology's divisive returns, we see that whether understood as the return of science and theory or the return of pseudoscience and speculation, whether framed in relation to the impossible return of and to a stolen homeland, which is the work that Said did on philology or through philology, or the refused return of a repressed complicity, which many of us know was precisely de Mon's condition, philology is not simply an empty vessel or a dead mother to be recovered from the ruins of the present humanities. It is a mobile signifier whose repetitions are entangled with the crisis of the humanities in a scene that the humanities are called upon to witness. The survival harbors an enduring set of risks and attachments that we cannot ignore. Can there be a future for the humanities that is both affirmative and detached from colonial violence and repression? So while I've been focused on Europe and its legacies, including those in the United States, I now want to turn to the case of China. Well, from a philological perspective, humanities is an untranslatable, evoking the panel earlier. It is also a word and a concept that increasingly circulates in a globalized system of knowledge dominated by English and in the negotiation of institutional forms modeled after those in the US and Europe. Or to put it in the terms that we encountered earlier, is the humanities always translated into English before it ends up in other languages? So is there always a kind of English translation? In China, where the fraught relationship between the humanities and human rights continues to be played out, it turns out that violent force was always part of the modern university's public mission, to use Newfield's language. As Wang Wei, who directs our member institute at Tsinghua and who's a member of the CHCI board, has explained, the modern Chinese university emerged with the founding in 1881 of Beiyang Naval School, which connected philology to its global project, requiring daily study of Chinese classics and English language, as well as technical courses taught in English and embedding the humanities within a military education. Beiyang was the precursor to Peking Beijing University, which expanded its offerings in the humanities, ultimately to include not only Chinese classics, but also literature and history, as well as sciences, law, agriculture, and the professions. Wang Wei uses this example to reflect upon the entanglement of the Chinese, American, and university systems, and identifies 3 stages in the recent history of the humanities in China. These include the removal of all international and scholarly standards, whereby the humanities became pure ideology, followed by the establishment of a university system that had scholarly and intellectual relevance outside of China in the mid-1990s. However, the latest developments in China suggest still another stage. The former relevance and influence of the humanities has been supplanted by a new international strategy, that incorporates rather than overcomes violence and ideology. In many ways, it appears as if the humanities in China are flourishing, leading to international conferences, collaborations, and commitments. I should say the institutional humanities. Yet, can the institutional humanities flourish even as censorship and repression are the norm? Can they have international resonance while ignoring political violence? Increasingly well-endowed and well-supported, the state-supported humanities in China have become a source of soft, and sometimes even more than soft power, made more powerful by the defunding of the humanities in the rest of the world or in many other parts of the world. Their new stability, unlike the precarity and risk experienced in the United States and in Europe, is correlated to what Wang Wei calls a new orthodoxy, which also produces what he does not explicitly state, a set of distractions and justifications for ongoing abuses of freedom and human rights. I read in Wang Wei's History of the Humanities in China that the humanities and the university today can be made to live and apparently flourish, but they do so in a context where inquiry without condition is foreclosed. The history that he tells reminds us that the Chinese university is, despite its explicit commitments to the humanities today, as it was at its outset, a project with military, industrial, and political motivations, the product of national salvation and survival. And those are Wang Wei's words. The place in the world where the humanities are most apparently alive and most robustly supported is also where they have been left for dead. The life drive here is a cipher, a face, and a veil. I would like to conclude not by outlining a set of new strategies or fashioning a new polemic, but by asking, in light of the account that I've just provided, whether there could be non-redemptive, non-apocalyptic strategies for the humanities. And I would like to ask whether we can break from these dramas of life and death and the violences that they permit, or whether all that we can do is become increasingly aware of them and commit to reworking them and sustaining the humanities in this way, even if it also sometimes means ignoring an impasse. So returning to Sydney Smith's manifesto, where I understood sustainability as just another example of the new life drive and the discourse surrounding the humanities, I also find in its somewhat modest and deeply pragmatic tone, this is not mass building or even moral life, but mere sustainability and what she calls, after Winnicott, and also like Maggie Nelson, good enough times. Maybe we can find there a seed of possibility. First, the way that Smith understands sustainability is surprisingly as a form of non-reproduction. Similarly, many arguments about sustainability in an environmental idiom also focus on the non-reproduction of our practices and institutions. This logic, whereby the future is dissociated from reproduction, evokes, even if it differs from, arguments like those of Lee Edelman in No Future. Even more recently, in an essay on queer philology, Danielle Link, who runs a center at the at University of Buenos Aires and also at UNTREF in Buenos Aires, or just outside, asks, and with whom many of us had the chance to meet many years ago, and hopefully we'll meet again when we're all in Chile, Danielle Link asks another version of these questions. How to teach, how to develop a non-reproductive or non-reproductivist pedagogy that recovers the power of transformation that the humanities once had without being confined to the cabinet of useless curiosities. Yet for all of our efforts at self-preservation, non-reproduction is also one of the significant methods of the humanities. In the climate of history and the planetary age, the seeds of which Dipesh Chakrabarty presented at a CHCI meeting in Australia many, many years ago, Dipesh Chakrabarty, for example, stakes out a new set of scholarly alliances and practices to reflect on his own version of non-self-reproduction and his break from post-colonial theory. He explains, the fact of the planet coming into view in the everyday lives of humans leads us to question whether the relationship of mutuality between humans and the Earth world that many 20th century thinkers inherited, assumed, and celebrated has become untenable today. And he goes on to ask, how do we move in the face of the current ecological crisis toward composing a new commons, a new anthropology, as it were? We could call this a new humanities, not just a new anthropology, in search of a redefinition of human relationships to the non-human, including the planet. And returning to the genealogy of survival that I mentioned earlier, Stern leaves us at the end of that book with the same question with which he began. Who is speaking of survival? A question that he proposes to answer by inventing a new imaginary figure of scholarly perseverance, a fiction of the face. And each of these texts link Chakrabarty, Stern, which also belong to distinct traditions in the humanities, Latin American studies, post-colonial history, critical religious studies. These questions and the alternate futures and practices that they anticipate suggest a path that might be neither a life drive nor an apocalyptic collapse, even as they each are fully engaged with the histories and theories of life and survival. And all of this leads me to ask whether it is the question of survival, inquiry without condition. Questions like, what is the relation between survival and dispersion? Where do the humanities live? Under what conditions? That will be how the humanities persist, persevere, and endure. So moving back one last time, from the poetic to the pragmatic, I'm convinced that these are not merely rhetorical questions, nor are they strictly theoretical ones. They are the same questions that academic departments, at least in North America, ask every time hiring season rolls around. At that moment, the question inevitably surfaces whether to replace the faculty who have retired with those in the same fields or to create spaces for new fields and new voices, often in interdisciplinary, emergent, or historically underrecognized areas of research and teaching. Do these new voices have a place in our university, if it means having to give up areas of study that it seems always belong there and thus always should belong? Is non-reproduction a form of risk, or is it a form of survival? And can it be both? These questions and strategies of differentiation give us some sense that there can be non-reproductive substitutions. So too do the emerging sites of the humanities with which I began. Mobile, adjacent, temporary, instrumentalist, and activist, reveal how collaborations within and beyond the university, even as they appear to be acts of abandonment, are also instances of survival. Humanities centers and institutes are uniquely positioned to be the site where we work through these questions. They are so precisely because these questions are not, for us, sites of existential risk, but rather they're the very conditions of our possibility and the character of our value. Humanities centers and institutes are, in other words, the institutional site where the humanities can remain in question. And it's this, not survival, that is the future we must face. Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any, or discussion.
Stina Lux wants to know, can you say more about the life drive as cipher?
Yeah, so I think I can. The reason I think about it as a cipher is that it actually covers over two things. One, it because it's redemptive, it is symbolic, and in that sense, it is a kind of mere substitution of life for death and death for life. One that actually doesn't get us out of some of the. I feel like I want to look at the person who has asked the question, but I'm answering it into the ether. But in fact, it actually repeats the kind of deathliness or the evacuation by kind of subsuming it, right? So in that sense, it's neither life nor death would be one way of putting it. But I feel like that's not quite a clear enough answer, but that's how I would start to reflect on it.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a great talk. That was really wonderful. I would love to debate you, but
I know you would.
I'm not gonna.
I was like,
I'm going to use
the
Chris
moral
Newfield
life,
instead. But okay, I'll just say one thing. I think that the inferential leap from the phrase "the moral life" is unwarranted. But that's all I'm going to say. Okay.
There's no life in moral life.
Pardon?
There's no life in moral life.
No, it's not a life-death thing. It's okay. And it's disenchanted. Anyway, okay. So what I'm really struck by, and I think Chris Newfield does this as well, and I'm going to say that it kind of inheres in your method, which is to say that and I loved your last reference to the poetic versus the pragmatic, because I think that's utterly crucial, because you end with the pragmatic, okay? So what it seems to me is that the critique relies fundamentally on the poetic. It relies on an analysis of highly selected moments, rhetorical moments in text, to mount a critique of what feels a little bit like a normative impasse, right? I mean, if you invoke a certain form of a certain binary of life and death, or if there's any, and that seems to create a hint of redemption, then you're necessarily within a theological narrative, and then you are ipso facto in a Christian narrative, and then you're part of empire and everything bad, okay? And that, the kind of, I would just call it an indicting drive, is propped on a rhetorical analysis, okay, on a tropological analysis, which is then replaced by a shift to the pragmatic, to sustainability, to a smaller scale. And I think this is actually a move that is really, really prevalent in a lot of discourse on the humanities. And all I'm going to say is I think Chris does it too. See, I think Christopher Newfield. That he too, and particularly in that piece, but lots of places, is like really, taken up with and forceful about all of the kind of power-laden problems in the humanities. Very, very forceful about it. But when he turns to what can be done, he's especially now that he's out of the academy and in the research academy in London, he's got a multiplicitous and pragmatic, very much like your final list. And it's really kind of just an observation, but I just wonder if there's if there more than a little tension between the reliance on a tropological rhetoric that at some level you're saying is the problem, in order to diagnose the problem, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so the final move, which you could think of in terms of a kind of slippage, which is partly implicit in what you're saying, is to reaffirm institutional spaces where there's certain kinds of, debate, right? But not just debate in a dialogic way where it's like, okay, let's have a debate, Amanda Anderson, but like, in fact, there's a kind of opening, and and maybe some of the things that were talked about yesterday around hospitality, where there's forms of contestation, where there's forms of disagreement, where there's irresolution. And now I think you disagree with this, but one of the things that is critically important for the humanities is how the humanities can stay with a question and how the humanities can stay with irresolution. This part you're gonna maybe disagree with. Ongoing inquiry. I thought irresolution you might have some ambivalence about, but that I think almost nowhere else in the university can stay that long, which is why, when we read something that was published in 1945 or 1975 and find it extraordinarily valuable today, other parts of the university would think that that was over and done with, right? And there is a particular form in the humanities of reading and untimeliness that it doesn't live comfortably elsewhere. So that's one piece. But your kind of broader point, like, okay, can you both read tropologically and act with a form of intervention, or is there always going to be a leap between the rhetorical and the intervention? And my argument here is, I mean, that's what I was trying to say about impasse. It's like, you're right, there's a tension, and you just have to move through the impasse so that you're not giving up on tropological reading and you're not giving up on action. And it's precisely, and that's like, we might disagree about this, but that it's in that movement and that, you know, ignorance and that admission that you might have to like ignore the fact that you can't get from the impasse of reading to the action of, or the advocacy for the humanities that we can work through and work in. And I think that that's how I would answer that point, or answer that comment, or respond to that comment.
Thanks also for such a wonderful talk. This is really more of a comment, and I'm just following up on what has emerged as a discussion of Chris Newfield's work. Because among other things, I read him as following the finances as something that is absolutely crucial. So he reads in many, many, many ways and is multilingual in all kinds of ways of doing the humanities. Most people don't know that he's made a film on energy and on solar panels with people, followed that in wonderful, wonderful ways. But I want to return for a second to his book, The Great Mistake. And some of you will help me with the subtitle, which is What Happened to the Humanities, What We Can Do, and How We Can Fix It. It's something like that, following the kind of trope of what comes after the colon now for lots of books. Towards the end of that book, he reports on the kind of teaching that he's been doing in Santa Barbara, and he's exhilarated by his experiences with his students, absolutely exhilarated. And he says for him, he believes what is the function of an undergraduate education is in great part to make people capable of doing research. And he then adds what is crucial to all of that is to allow the flourishing of creativity among his students, which is something that he shares with Sid Smith in her book, also a manifesto for the humanities, graduate education in good enough times, something like that. So I think this is partially in defense of Chris Newfield. No, I know, I heard that.
Thanks, Sherry. Oh, does Teresa have her hand up?
Actually, I was partly going to go where Kathy went toward teaching, because there was a turn in your paper where you headed toward the pedagogical and didn't keep, but then spun in a different direction. And it does seem to me frequently that we underestimate the ground we can stand on when we don't think about the humanities and pedagogy and what we bring to our colleagues. And I've been really thinking about that since COVID and through COVID, that I think humanities classes have been one of the few spaces where students have found a place to talk through what they're experiencing using literature, using art, using theater and history. And I've watched my colleagues change the way they teach, rethink their purpose on an almost weekly basis as they responded to the need in front of them in undergrad and graduate classrooms. So I just wonder where pedagogy fits into your fascinating and broad thinking about the humanities.
That's great. I mean, I think I'll just give an example. So I met a week or two ago with a group of undergraduates, and they were coming from different departments, English and music and philosophy. And some of them were first generation students. One of them was a double major with data science and music. And so we were just talking about ways that they felt like they wanted to advocate for the humanities. And there was this one woman, she was Nigerian American. She'd started off at a community college and then had transferred to university, and she's a philosophy major. And she said to me, and we started talking about how she told her parents that she had decided to major in philosophy, and the like pain that went into communicating this. And she said, the only way I know how to understand and talk to other people without anxiety is because of philosophy. And I learned that through my courses, that like the antidote to alienation and anxiety was thinking, philosophy, reading, learning, logic. I mean, which is not the humanities that all of us do, but actually learning how to make an argument. And so there was something in that it's very easy to lose when we talk about pedagogy, right? We talk about formation in a discipline, which is extremely important. Like I don't in any way think that we can fully abandon formation and discipline. We talk about all these things, but like the fact that this woman described to me that she needed philosophy in order to live, and that she learned that initially in a community college and then at a public university, that seemed to me something that we need to understand how to talk about and how to embrace. And now, of course, I'm saying that in the context of thinking about redemption, right? So like, and the life drive. And here I am saying like, here, the thing that like was most kind of persuasive and powerful to me about this experience of this young woman was that she learned how to live through the humanities. But in fact, that is one way that I would take the story, is that these are resources for living, and that's not, and I think radically different from the kind of work that you're doing, Amanda, which is to see how to live aware, maybe disenchanted life. I mean, those are resources for living, which is different from and this is to a certain extent the point that you're making, which is different from a certain kind of Bildung, sacred sacrological vision of the humanities that you get in some of the discourse on the humanities right now. And maybe I would want to close with two thoughts. One is that one of our turns is often one where we have a kind, our response to crisis can be one of self-righteousness. And like, we actually understand better than anyone else in the university how to live and how to survive. And we are actually the ones who know how to do things and know how to make sense of the world. And so part of my trying to think through the kind of more the kind of reclaiming of the humanities, to move from crisis to reclaiming, is not to be self-righteous. And I think, what are the non-self-righteous ways that we can inhabit the work that we do, not apologize for it, not remove ourselves, but also not have a sense of grandiosity that seems completely unwarranted. And I think that's actually really, really hard to do, to make arguments without grandiosity, because the entire history of the humanities is built on grandiosity, right? And especially the history of the European humanities. So one of the effects of a turn away from the European humanities, as it has been taught in American and European and international universities for years and years and years. I think of like James Ogude, who maybe is still in the room, talking about, reading British poetry in Kenya. There's a sense of grandiosity. How do we not just recover grandiosity. Oh, there you are, James. Recover grandiosity on the far side of crisis. And then finally, the other thing is that I think many of us who are scholars coming out of a tradition like the one that I come out of find ourselves stuck between advocacy and action and intervention and the kind of rigor and carefulness and caution and commitment that is our intellectual work. And I don't think we actually have good tools that allow us to navigate the tension between the powers of close reading and arrival at the impasse and the need to constantly act. And I think that it is within these conversations that we can start to come up with better arguments for how to be in a humanities that doesn't sacrifice the humanities to a kind of redemptive service modality, but also doesn't just capitulate to a kind of insularity and refusal. And so those are the two places where this intervention comes from. So thank you. But above all, this also is the end of our meeting at Duke, which means that there are many, many, many people to thank. So the thank yous will last more or less as long as my long talk, but I will begin by trying to acknowledge some of them. First of all, and please, if I'm missing anyone or anything, I want to thank the CHCI board and the CHCI planning committee that went into planning the conference, Pramesh Lalu, Sylvester Johnson, Lydia Liu, Prathama Banerjee, and also, of course, Guillaume and Erin, and those of you who are here at Duke. So please join me in thanking most of them, none of whom are in the room, I think, other than Ranji, but many fabulous panelists, speakers, and keynotes, and just I'm going to do my best to name everyone, but Pat Parker, who hosted us at UNC. It was great to be able not only to be here, I think you are here, you're still there. Robert Newman, who's not here, who hosted us this morning, and all of your staffs and all of those who helped bring us here. Our distinguished speakers, Nathaniel Mackey, Massimo Leone, who agreed to speak with an hour's notice, Akira Lippett, all of you who introduced panelists and chaired panels, the staff at the Nasher, here at the Penn Pavilion, at the Duke Gardens, and wonderful graduate student assistants who have just made everything work so beautifully and so smoothly. Dina, Lucy, Anvita, and Nova. Okay, the unbelievable Chris Chia. So Sylvia Miller, who's been a long-standing friend and partner of CHCI. So thank you to Sylvia. And kind of this back row of IT and just general support staff that allowed us to have a hybrid meeting, which is no easy feat. It's like maybe the hardest thing to do. So among the people at FHI are Pamela Moore, Eric Barstow, Eli Meyerhoff, Lou Brown, Jennifer Zhu, MD Murtagh, Pan Montgomery, and Mary Williams, who are familiar names for being great hosts to CHCI a long time ago. So thank you, all of you. And we also have site visit partners for tomorrow, the Durham Black Burial Grounds Collaboratory, Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, Stephanie Davis, the Duke Campus Farm, don't get poison ivy, Unearthing Duke Forest, the Duke Forest, and finally, above all, Ranji Khanna, thank you again for a gorgeous meeting.